practical overview of the Bell Foundation's EAL Assessment Framework for schools and present a case for thorough and robust EAL assessment in the international school context. The overall aim of the webinar is to provide you with pragmatic specialist guidance regarding EAL assessment in the context of what is realistic and what can work alongside existing systems. And if there is time at the end, Tom will take any questions that you may have. So feel free to type your questions in the chat box as they come to you during the webinar or at the end. I will collect them and pose them to Tom at the end. And just to let you know, tomorrow you will receive an email from us with a link to access the video recording of this webinar if you want to come back to it or share it with your colleagues. But enough of me now. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Tom Beeks. Tom Beeks joined the Bell Foundation in 2020. But he has worked in language education since 2003 and has taught in a range of countries, including China, Japan, Ecuador, and North Africa. His main areas of interest are teaching young learners, project-based learning, and teacher development. He holds an MA in anthropological linguistics and is also CELTA and Delta qualified. He has worked as a teacher trainer in the UK and abroad, and is also a regular speaker at English language conferences such as IATEFL. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Shaka, for the lovely introduction. So let's get straight into it. Welcome everyone, and hello. Hope you're all doing well today. If you haven't already, feel free to write in the chat box where you are, because it's really nice to see where people are joining us from. And also, you can also write maybe what your role is in your school, because it's also nice to see what kinds of different types of role we have joining us. So today's webinar, we're going to cover a few different areas. We'll look at why EAL assessment is important. We're going to look at the EAL Assessment Framework for schools that the Bell Foundation have developed, and it's going to be a little bit of an introduction to that for people who may not be familiar with it, but we'll also be exploring some ideas around it. So if you're already familiar with it, then we're also going to be looking at ways in which it can be used in an international context. We're also going to give you some information about the tracker, which is a tool that we've developed that uses the framework to track the progress of individual students. And we're going to then be connecting both the framework and the tracker to practical ideas for practitioners in terms of assessment and EAL provision in general. Okay, so it's going to be quite a sort of broad overview, but there are a number of key ideas that we'll be returning to throughout the webinar. And if you do have any questions, you can write them in the chat box. My colleague Shaka will record them, and at the end we can come back to them if they aren't answered in the presentation itself. Okay, so the sort of deeper learning intentions for today then are, as I've mentioned, to give you a deeper understanding of why EAL assessment is important, and to explore a little bit more deeply what the EAL Assessment Framework for Schools is and how it can be used in an international school context. And that, of course, will allow you hopefully to think about strengthening the EAL assessment in your school as it exists currently, and ultimately that's to benefit the learners who will be able to access the curriculum better and achieve their academic potential if their needs are being properly met. Okay, so let's move on to why assessment is so important. Of course, this is a really huge and complex topic, okay, but I'm just going to outline 3 core facts or pieces of evidence or research that I think should inform EAL assessment in a school context, okay? And I think it's really important that all teaching staff and school leaders are aware of these if they are working in an English medium school environment where there are English language learners, which I'm sure is probably everybody here. So the first point to make is that proficiency in English is crucially linked to attainment. Okay, here you can see some quotes from a piece of research by Steve Strand and Anna Hessel from the University of Oxford. I'll let you read those quotes. So as you can see, the basic point here is that the pupil's attainment increases with greater English proficiency. Okay, now this is probably something that seems like stating the complete obvious to most EAL practitioners who work in an international setting. Okay, but what I wanted to kind of I think make you aware of is that for staff coming from outside the international sector to work in an international school, perhaps coming from English-speaking countries, this may not be as obvious as it seems. So it's something that we need to bear in mind and make sure people know, and that it's supported by the research. Secondly, again, some more research carried out by Professor Strand, which analysed some data from local authorities in the UK on the proficiency of English of pupils who use English as an additional language, found that this link between achievement and proficiency in English is consistent across year groups and subjects. Okay, in fact, we can actually see here that in the UK, learners using EAL actually achieved above the national average if they were at higher proficiency. So if they were in the sort of top couple of bands. And this shows that EAL support and assessment needs to be embedded across all subject areas and stages of education. One size does not fit all in terms of EAL provision. And again, most of us who have worked in international education will know this from experience. But it's worth noting that the research backs up our own experiences and shows that learners who use EAL have the potential to be and often are high achievers. And I think it's really important for us to resist any narratives or attitudes that conflate using EAL with SEN, with special educational needs, or that have a deficit perspective of language learning, where a learner's home language is are ignored or not valued in the classroom. And I think also to ensure that there isn't a one-size-fits-all mindset approach to EAL. We know it's not a binary state. We know that we need to know where in their development a learner is, and robust EAL assessment will help us get there. And a third point I wanted to make is about this issue of time to progression. Okay, so this is how long it takes for a learner to achieve a particular level. So I'm going to just open it out there. I wonder if anyone would like to be brave and take a guess in the chat box about how long on average you think it takes a learner to go from new to English, sort of beginner level, up to academic fluency. I don't know if anyone's brave enough to type a guess in terms of number of years this might take. Okay, there's some good responses coming here, and it's nice to see that you're all, I think, pretty spot on here, because the research shows us that the research gives us some pretty solid indicators of how long it generally takes students to develop language proficiency. It is, as people are saying, it's obviously, there's no one single correct answer, but the research is pointing towards it takes 6 or more years to go from new to English to fluent. And again, the research from Strand and Lindorff that this particular diagram is based on shows that regardless of starting time, this will be the case. So it doesn't matter if they're entering the school in reception or year 1, or if they're entering at a higher level, then this time frame remains more or less the same. So again, this highlights the importance of tracking progress of proficiency in English and the importance of ensuring that teachers, children and parents understand the length of time it realistically takes to take a pupil to become fully academically proficient. Of course, I think in an international school context, where it differs from the UK perhaps is that it's common for learners to spend time in some kind of intensive EAL support program before moving over into mainstream lessons. So I think it's really important to reinforce to teaching staff that language support is still needed, even for competent and fluent learners, if they are to achieve the language level that will allow them to succeed in the curriculum. Of course, the levels of support will vary at different stages, but it means that EAL assessment is vital so that learners continue to receive the support they need right up to fluency. Okay, let's take a look at the framework. Some of you may already be familiar with this, but I'm going to just spend a couple of slides kind of explaining the basics for anyone who is new to the framework and hasn't used it or seen it before. So the first thing to say is that the EAL Assessment Framework for Schools is freely available via the Bell Foundation website. Although you will have to register and log in to access it. It's designed to be accessible for busy classroom teachers in both primary and secondary settings. And you will see that there are two sets of descriptors, one set for primary and one for secondary. And that's because obviously the language demands and the context in which language is used differs in these stages of education. I think another point that I really want to get across about the framework is it wasn't just thrown together. We didn't just sit down and put it together over an afternoon. It was created over a number of years in conjunction with some of the UK's leading experts in assessment. And it was originally designed for use in a UK context. So that's why in this webinar we're looking at how it might be adapted for use in an international situation. They used rigorous research methods, using information from actual classroom practitioners to determine the framework descriptors and place them broadly in order of progression. And that was led by Professor Constant Lung and his colleagues. Yeah, if you want to find out more, there are talks by Constant and Yongzhan available on the Foundation website and other sources which go into more detail about the processes they used if anyone's interested in that. So the descriptors have all been organized by skill, with all bands and internal descriptors displayed on a single page. The 4 domains are listening, speaking, reading and viewing, and writing. Obviously, by separating the domains, teachers can better focus on the strengths and areas of development for each area, which is, if you're an EAL specialist, is something you'll be very familiar with. Okay, there are 5 bands to the framework, starting from new to English and going up to fluent. These bands mirrored the terminology that was being used in the UK in terms of categorizing EAL learners, but they're universal and can be applied in any context. So looking at the framework in a little bit more detail, as I mentioned, the descriptors are organized by skill, and each page there's a page for each skill, and the descriptors at the top of that page will show early development, and the descriptors closer to the bottom are getting closer to the next band. However, it's important to note that these are not expected to be achieved in order. Okay, different learners will achieve things at different rates, and different descriptors will tend to be connected to different areas of the curriculum as well. So depending on what type of lesson you're observing, you might notice different proficiency in different bands. This example is a speaking descriptors. So I'm not sure if you're able to read the detail there, but if you can see that, for example, descriptor number 1 says can produce simple phrases and greetings, and that's obviously broadly at a lower stage of development than descriptor 9, which talks about the student can communicate some lesson content in longer, more correct utterances, supported by scaffolding, so that they gradually get more more complex broadly as they go up each band. That's a good question, Liliana. I'll come to that at the end, and I might mention it later in the presentation about the CEFR. At the core of the EAL assessment framework for schools are the assessment descriptors, and teachers can use these for both summative and formative assessment purposes. So for formative assessment, the assessment descriptors and the proficiency bands can be used as a roadmap for progress. Teachers, TAs, and other staff working with EAL learners can use the assessment descriptors to check pupil performance and to plan ahead, to set targets and so on. For summative assessment, then it can also be used as an end of term or year assessment tool on the basis of tasks and activities that tap into the knowledge and skills represented by the descriptors set out in the rating scales. Now, I know this is always a recurring issue in international schools, is having, adequate diagnostic and evaluative tools for use in school. We don't have an easy answer at the moment. As mentioned, at the moment, in terms of using the framework, you will have to create your own task aligned to the what's in the framework if you wanted to use the framework for that purpose. Although I will say that later in the year we are going to be publishing some assessment tasks which will be sort of ready-made for assessing learners against the framework. So watch this space, but they're coming later in the year. So this framework sounds great and wonderful and lovely, okay? And we have been, since it was released in I think 2017, we've been really overwhelmed with positive feedback, both from the UK and from users overseas in international schools as well. However, I think it's really important to understand that the context in which international schools operate is extremely diverse, and there are numerous challenges, okay? So, for example, we know that there can be a lack of specialist EAL expertise in some schools. Perhaps there can be a reliance on ELT support from unqualified staff in some cases, and there's a rise in some countries in bilingual schools where there may be less expertise because they're just not familiar yet with this kind of bilingual international education system yet. Another recurring issue, I think, in the international sector is a high turnover of teaching staff. There's a lot of teacher churn as teachers return to home countries or move jobs. Thirdly, I think there's often a lot of pressure from parents, especially in terms of getting students into mainstream lessons as quickly as possible, and making sure that their children learn English very quickly. And as I say, they don't always have realistic expectations in that regard. And of course, this is exacerbated in contexts where they have to pay extra for EAL support. And there may be a sort of deficit view of learners who use EAL from parents. So it can be quite a tricky issue to deal with, that one. And lastly, I think teacher resistance can always be problematic. And this can often stem from attitudes imported from teachers' home countries, where they may have had little or no training or experience of working with learners who use EAL. And as mentioned before, sometimes EAL can be sort of equated with special educational needs, and some teachers may not consider it sort of their problem. And I think these are all things that we need to carefully consider when putting into place any kind of assessment and support, that we need to think of how we're going to approach some of these issues. So I'm going to talk now a bit more practical terms about how we see the framework being used. Okay, so I'm basically going to look at some examples of ways in which we've seen the framework being used. This comes both from the UK, where we first started using the framework, but also in international situations, because there's some interesting differences there. So firstly, we've seen the framework being used as a roadmap for EAL development. It helps teachers understand what to look for in assessment, and it's also used as a professional development tool for teachers in terms of helping them understand EAL development more deeply. And I think this is a particularly important contribution of the framework to teacher professional knowledge and teacher professional development, given that EAL continues to be an underdeveloped and under-provisioned area of sort of initial and in-service teacher education, especially initial teacher education. I know that a lot of international schools have good in-service programs. Secondly, it's as mentioned before, a very useful resource for continuous assessment for learning. It can be used by class teachers and EAL specialists to identify pupils' current level of proficiency and identify gaps, which can be the immediate focus of pedagogical support. And of course, the division of the framework into the different sections is highly appreciated because it enables teachers to monitor the progression or lack of progression of specific domains of language knowledge and skills. And I think this is obviously when we first created the framework, this is probably what we were thinking of as being the key function. And lastly, the curriculum embedded descriptors are very helpful to class teachers, not just EAL specialists, because the descriptors are contextualized according to the curriculum. They're not independent of the curriculums, such as a framework like the CFR, which we've mentioned, which is a fantastic framework, but it's not connected to the curriculum at all. It's completely independent. It just talks about language use independent of context, whereas this is all the descriptors are related to how language gets used in the classroom. Therefore, it can often be more appropriate for use, especially by staff who are not EAL specialists, so class teachers, subject teachers, and so on. Targets are contextualized and therefore a lot more relevant for the learner and for the teacher setting them. And lastly, I think this has been an interesting use that we've seen, particularly in a lot of international schools, is that some schools are working with the framework as the basis for an EAL curriculum. Now, the framework is directly aligned to the English national curriculum. And by English, I mean the country, not the language. So, and the language expectations that are required across subjects in the UK. However, it is quite universal in the way that the descriptors are framed. So it can be used in other curriculum settings as well. And I think this potentially makes it a stronger basis for an EAL curriculum in comparison to an ELT curricula or a framework like the CFR, which, as I've said, is kind of decontextualized and is I think very useful if you're working as a sort of English language teacher specifically, but when you're working in the subject areas, it's less helpful. So in an English medium context, and in a context where people are doing assessment, or in a context where people doing the assessment may not be ELT or EAL specialists, I think the framework can be very helpful. Okay, so let me talk to you a little bit now about the tracker that we use with the framework to monitor individual students and record their progress. So we'll talk a little bit about what it is and then how we can use it. I'm not going to go into depth in this webinar because it doesn't really lend itself to the kind of webinar format for a start. And we also have further videos and resources that tell you in detail about the use of it. So if you are interested, you can go and look at those. But as an overview, what is the tracker? Well, it's an Excel tool, basically. So it's an Excel spreadsheet. Again, you can be freely downloaded from our website. It's designed for formative and summative purposes. It's designed to be used per pupil, so you can maintain a record of each pupil that you're looking after in theory. And there is one for primary and there's one for secondary, just as with the framework. The key features of the tracker are that within the spreadsheet, it has the EAL Assessment Framework descriptors embedded within it. Okay, so you can easily click and choose the correct descriptors to show where the student is at the moment and where they need to be. There's a pupil profile form, so there's a template basically with gaps for information where you can provide useful information about the learner and their background. You can record initial assessment as well as ongoing targets. So again, there's space to input both those sets of information. I'm not going to go into detail about how to do that at the moment because it's a little bit fiddly and we haven't got time to go into details. But if you want to know more, we will post some links to the our guidance videos that are on YouTube. And also embedded within the tracker, and this is really helpful, I think, are the EAL Foundation classroom support strategies. Okay, you may be aware that the support strategies are a separate document that we've created to support teachers, and basically it's a big PDF broken down into the different bands of proficiency, and within each band there's a whole list of different strategies and approaches and ideas that teachers can use to support learners in different areas of the classroom. So it's a really helpful document, but it is quite overwhelming because it's just one long PDF, especially if you're not an EAL specialist to look at. So by integrating these into the tracker, it allows you to kind of break these strategies down, and it allows teachers to sort of match a strategy to a target. So if, say, a student, you want to help them improve their listening skills, you can identify some useful strategies that address that issue and integrate them into your targets relatively easily on the tracker. And lastly, the tracker allows you to create a termly or regular report. You can generate the report at the end of term or whenever you need to, based on the information that you've inputted, and it provides a little graphic that shows you, broadly speaking, how the learner is developing and more or less where they are at the moment. And here's an example of that. So the tracker allows you to collect useful data and easily share it with others. It allows you to create basic but useful graphics like this, which show the overall progress, but also the language targets. So on the left, you can see where the learner is at each of the, the first column there is the initial assessment, then there's the subsequent assessments, and then there's their target. They show all overall progress, but also the language targets, which can be written there, and they can be taken directly from the framework, or they can be edited by the teacher specifically for that learner. And it's helpful for staff and parents alike to get an understanding of where the child is and where they need to go. And we can also give an overall summary there of a sort of best fit judgment of current progress. So you can see that learner there would be broadly in band C. They still have some band B. They're still operating at band B in a couple of descriptors, and they're up to band D in a couple of descriptors too. But overall they're operating at band C level, which is the developing competence level. Okay, so we're going to move on now and devote most of the rest of the webinar to giving you some practical ideas for practitioners. Okay, these are connected to the use of the framework and the tracker, but not necessarily they're not necessarily reliant on them. So it's general suggestions of good practice, really. But we will link them to the framework and tracker where appropriate. All right, so let's have a look at some ideas. I realize I've been talking for quite a long time now, so just to build in a little bit of interaction, one of the ways that we can use the framework is to help us build a pupil profile. So in the chat box, what information is useful to find out about a learner who uses EAL before they join your school? What kind of things might you want to know about? Just write any ideas you have in the chat box. Excellent. Hobbies, culture, previous schooling, literacy, English spoken at home, home language. Okay, some really excellent suggestions coming through there. Do they read? In their MT, what is MT? Mother tongue, ah yes. Previous school vocabulary, languages used at home, oh yeah, some excellent suggestions. Family, yeah, okay. Yes, you're all clearly on the right wavelength here, which is excellent. Yeah, I'm nodding in agreement with all these suggestions. So yeah, I think as many of you have mentioned in the chat, then possible useful information to find out both languages spoken is really useful to know. Yeah, I think, and I think all these points have already been mentioned in the chat. So yeah, what languages get spoken at home? What languages are spoken by the learner? And who speaks which language to who? So, are they getting one language from one parent, one language from another? Do they speak one thing with their grandparents and another thing with their parents and, and another one with their friends, however? And as we know in international context, you can get some pretty eclectic and really interesting sort of language environments that children end up in. And it'll all help us inform their use of English in the school. And previous schooling is probably the other key bit of information. I noticed people have also mentioned things like hobbies and personal information, and absolutely that's really helpful too. So yeah, we have their prior education. Have they had English medium education? Have they come from their home, a national system from their home country? That links in, I think, to culture, which is really important. What is their educational culture and expectations? Maybe that, especially if they've come from a national system, the way that they've learned has been very different to how learning is conducted at your school. Of course, learners' attainment, and have they got any prior English language teaching and learning experience or any qualifications? Yeah, and I think Nikki makes a good point, which is parents are not always the best judges of their child's language ability for various reasons. So, having an assessment process and building a good profile of the pupil is a really good idea. So here are some helpful ideas. Sorry about the weird formatting on my slide, but the ideas will reveal themselves, I promise. So when we're talking about initial assessment, then here are some principles which I suspect many of you are aware of. The first point I would make is to ensure a safe environment. Now, of course, I mean that from a physical safety point of view, it goes without saying, but what I'm really speaking about here is we want to create an emotionally safe space for the child in assessment, because it's really stressful. If you can imagine, starting a new school is a terrifying thing to do. Starting a new school in a second language must be an even more terrifying thing to do. So, making sure that we carry out initial assessment in a way that avoids any undue stress as much as possible. No. And then you can see below, we recommend, oh, I'm sorry, my slides are going a little bit funny here. Hold on a moment. Not sure what's happening there. There we go. So we recommend that in an ideal world, we delay formal testing by 2 or 3 weeks. And that's because we know that when learners first start at school, there's so many other things happening around them that they may not be able to give you a true indication of their actual language ability. So it's often best to wait until they've had time to settle in properly and they feel more comfortable. The other key thing is to try and observe their language use in different contexts. So obviously in school, that kind of means in different types of lessons. So, you know, how are they communicating in different subjects and different types of activity in the classroom, and also outside the classroom, you know, how are they relating to their peers and so on. And as I think has been mentioned already, it's really important to carry out some kind of home language assessment if you possibly can, to get a sense of where they are in their first or strongest language, because that will again strongly inform potentially how they will react to English language tuition as well, as we know that the stronger their home language skills are, the better that will help them learn English as well. And lastly, we recommend you avoid using age-related kind of school-wide assessments for initial assessment. So that's things like the kind of spelling and reading tests that we would give to learners whose first language is English, because again, it just tends to give you unhelpful data, and it often ends up kind of just upsetting and demoralizing the students if they're unable to access that kind of assessment. And yeah, Mary's got a point. It's really hard to delay. The whole delaying the formal testing thing is a great idea, but yeah, can be tricky. But I would argue that you know, as EL specialists, we have to advocate for these and try as much as we can to make sure that school systems can change. Because we do know of schools who are able to integrate areas of good practice in these things. It is possible, but it does require cooperation from upstairs. So we need to become advocates for these and sort of educate people onto why they're important. Okay. In terms of ongoing assessment then, we need to record progress and set targets across all 4 language strands. Again, as EAL specialists, kind of goes without saying perhaps for you, but if we're using class teachers or subject teachers to help with assessment, it's something that their attention needs to be drawn to, and to make sure that there is attention paid to all. There is a tendency, as we know, students can have very spiky profiles, as we say. So, perhaps their listening and speaking skills are amazingly well developed, but their reading and writing skills are really underdeveloped, or vice versa. And again, something to educate, I think, our colleagues about and to be aware of is that, of course, abilities change over time. So might be mindful that a pupil's ability in relation to different strands of language use will change over time. We know that learners will quickly progress in terms of their spoken language and communicative skills when they're put into an English medium environment. However, other skills may not improve as quickly. It's something to bear in mind. And of course, also that ability is modified by context. And by that, I mean that, a pupil's proficiency may differ depending on the context in which the language is being used. So, in terms of subject areas, they may be able to use English perfectly well in one subject, or perfectly communicatively, I should say, in one subject. But they may struggle more in other subjects depending on what the language needs are, because different subjects will have different language needs. And lastly, this point has kind of been added to our PowerPoint due to sort of current events, but I think we need to be aware that if there are any sort of changes or interruptions to a child's education and schooling, as there has been for many children this year, we may need to carry out additional diagnostic assessment if necessary. So, if a child has had to be away out of the classroom at home, whether that's homeschooling or learning online, we might want to just reassess where they are in terms of their language development in case they've changed. Yeah. Yeah, and there's some good points made in the chat. I think Nikki points out that needs can emerge as students transition from year 6 into year 7, and definitely the transition from primary into secondary is a big one as well, because there's you would often notice different needs emerging there. So a child that's kind of cruised through primary school may suddenly find that secondary school is a different kettle of fish and have different needs that need to be looked at. Absolutely. And I totally agree, Mary, that we do. EAL practitioners need to be valued more in our schools. It's hugely important. And again, hope that one of our purposes is to advocate for that and try and develop understanding. Okay, I'm just going to speak a little bit about classroom support strategies that are available, as I've mentioned, free to download on our website. You can see an example of a screen grab there, and you can see they are quite dense. So, I mean, personally, I find that if you want to use these they are aimed at, they're not necessarily aimed at EAL specialists, they're aimed at subject teachers and classroom teachers. So if you are an EAL specialist, though, we find that it can be really helpful for you to sort of, mediate or translate these for your colleagues to sort of break them down and make them seem less impenetrable, because there's just a lot of text there and it can be a bit overwhelming. So as a specialist, you can probably look at it and go, oh, okay, maybe you focus on this and this and this and this, and you can probably help the embedding of these in your school if you're able to do that. So again, the ideas here are pretty generic and again may seem kind of obvious, but this is what good practice should look like, and this is what we should be advocating for. So first of all, we want to use the support strategies across every skill, focusing on everything so that we have a balanced language development for our learners. A really important thing that perhaps might be missing from some teachers who are, especially if they've had a more sort of traditional training, or they come from a culture where education tends to be very teacher-centered, is that we need to allow as many opportunities as possible for in-context language use. So, allowing learners the opportunity to practice and use target language within the context of learning. So, again, that's something that we need to really advocate for. Maintaining high challenge, as we know, is really important, but can be quite hard, especially when you're working with learners at a low proficiency level. We need to draw on strategies that keep the cognitive challenge high and promote learning. So that means, keeping content rich, making sure the content is interesting, using translanguaging strategies to allow learners to access complex texts, using things like jigsaw activities or a dictogloss to add challenge, even when proficiency is low, because as we know, cognitive proficiency isn't necessarily low in these learners. It's just that their language level isn't quite where it needs to be for them to access the curriculum fully yet. And another resource that we recommend you may be helpful to you is the Great Ideas pages on the Bell Foundation website. And they basically take lots of these strategies and go into a little bit more detail about them. They explain why they're useful and give examples of how you can actually use them, which again, for staff who may not be familiar with these strategies, can be very useful. Okay, and lastly, the reports function that I talked about on the tracker, I think can be a very useful tool, but we do need to be also mindful of some considerations. So they're really good as a central reference point. Okay. They can be printed off and shared with parents or other key staff to indicate where learners are. And the comments box in the report allows you to personalize reports and make sure that, you know, your own knowledge of the learner can be included. You're not just relying on the generic descriptors from the framework, which are, you know, quite general. And to be considered is that, you know, the pie chart function that we have looks lovely, but it is very generic, so to be used with caution. There's not enough granularity there for it to be more than a general indication of where a learner is, because the proficiency bands are very broad. So yeah, it needs to be backed up with more information too. So that so it is just a best fit judgment, no more than that. Okay, so I'm just going to end with just telling you about a few other resources that that we are currently offering. First of which is our online courses. So we've just started to run some Language for Results International specific courses for staff in international schools. As you can see, some of the courses have already finished, but we do still have 2 courses that are coming up. Language awareness for teaching staff and supporting learners with the EAL for teaching assistants. So I should point out that the teaching staff one this is aimed at staff who perhaps don't have an EAL background or an English language teaching background, and who speak English as a first language, but perhaps lack the language awareness and understanding of how language works and what academic language proficiency looks like. So so that's who that's aimed at. So, you know, that may be helpful for staff in your school if they haven't had any training previously in that area. And obviously the last course is aimed specifically at teaching assistants, because again, our mantra is very much that EAL has to be a whole school effort. So there's no point just having, you know, amazing EAL specialists like many of you. That's great, but you also need that expertise and that understanding across the whole school. So teaching assistants are a really valuable resource, and so this course is specifically for them. So yeah, to find out more about that, you go online and you can book the courses. You can click through, and it's fairly obvious how to do that. If you have any trouble, just let us know. One other resource that could be useful is if you want to understand in more depth about the assessment framework, we have got this guidance document for international users. So this is where, as I mentioned before, the framework was originally created for a UK specific context, and that needs to be borne in mind. So this guide helps you consider how you might want to adapt your thinking, and if you're using the framework in an international context. If you're already working with the English national curriculum in your school, it probably requires much less, you know, consideration, because it'd probably be quite a good fit already. But you can find out more in that document. Lastly, we've already mentioned, I think, many of the resources for teachers that exist online. We have on our website access to free teaching resources for practitioners and guidance such as the great ideas that I mentioned earlier. Okay, I think that brings us to the end. Nikki, that's a really good question. Yeah, anyway, we come to the end, and we're going to ask, it's a chance to ask questions. So yeah, Sharka, I don't know if you've collated any questions. I've sort of been seeing.
Yes, there haven't been. Well, first of all, thanks, Tom, for the presentation. There haven't been many questions yet, but obviously, if people do have questions, do type them in the chat box. There is, yeah, the question from Nikki just now. Yeah, how best to overcome teachers who feel patronized by a language awareness, you know, for staff proposal, maybe by you suggesting that they take the course, because if they're not language aware, they might not realize they're not.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think actually probably something we need to think about in terms of how we're framing the course, perhaps. But also, I think from a I mean, first of all, the course isn't like, the way the course is designed, it isn't designed to be at all patronizing or kind of like, you people don't know anything at all like that. It's meant to be, the way I look at it is, it's promoting the idea that in an international context, all teachers need to be language teachers, okay? And it's about understanding the academic English needs of your learner. So really a way of framing it would be that it's a course that allows you to allows you to help your learners use academic English correctly in your context, which is what teachers want, right? Because they get fed up of marking these assignments where the language is mangled, and then they might blame the EAL teachers or whatever. Well, this is sort of the idea behind this course, is that they can take responsibility for that themselves, and actually they don't need to be language experts. And that's kind of the key message, that you don't need to be a language expert, you just need to be aware of some of the needs of your students. And it's no different to understanding that, if you're a maths teacher, you need to know if your student, I don't know, it's terrible, I chose the wrong subject, I know nothing about maths. Let's say if you're a geography teacher or something, and your student knows nothing about a particular area of geography, then that's an area that you would, in your teaching, that you would help them with, you would support them with. And this is no different in terms of them having gaps in their language or academic language use. That's something as a teacher that's your responsibility to help them with. And yeah, I mean, I understand that there will always be some resistance to that idea for teachers, but I think the advantage that teachers in an international context have over, say, teachers in a UK context is that you've chosen to work in an international context where your learners, do not necessarily speak English as a first language, and therefore, I think it should really be part of the job description. But yeah, it is a tricky one, and I think there's a lot of thought to be. My thought is, it often the attitudes towards these things come from the top, so it's about getting the buy-in of senior leaders where you can, or finding one particular senior leader who is particularly open to these ideas, and making sure that they're sending the right messages as well across the school. Because if you don't have that, it is an uphill battle. But yeah, I don't know, there are my sort of thoughts, but there is no easy answer to that question.
Of EAL and SCN together, because as we all know, I think that they have different needs, require different support, but still in many contexts they are grouped together and spoken about as a collective.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the thing is, it's perfectly possible for there to be an overlap, and of course in many cases there will be an overlap. There will be children who have who use English as an additional language who also have special educational needs. So it's not that the overlap doesn't exist, but it's being able as educators to distinguish between those things. And there's a document that a friend of my one of my colleagues alerted me to that was very helpful. I'm just seeing if I've got it on my computer because I was looking at it yesterday. But if I haven't, maybe I'll be able to post the link. If you just give me a second, there was a very useful paper that was written which talks about how you tease these two threads apart, and how you actually go about approaching special educational needs, and diagnosing the differences, the issues that are due to SEN and issues that are due to users just not having strong language skills. I'll see if I can. I think I've got it. Yeah, hold on one moment. One of my colleagues posted a link to me yesterday, so I'm gonna. Sorry. Okay. Ah, yes, there it is. Okay, I'm going to cut and paste that link. Post it in the chat box. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if that. Can you check that link works, Shaka? Is that?
And yes, it's open for me, so hopefully it will work for everyone.
Yeah, so that there's that. I mean, that was a it's not an easy. There's not a quick win, but it's a very complicated issue. But there's a document there which was created by some of the some organisations in the UK to address this issue that may be helpful for you. The dotty book. Yeah. So yeah, that's that. Again, and it's about a change of attitude across the school, really, and making sure that people understand that you know, a learner who's using English as a second language is just as capable cognitively as anyone else potentially, but it's about using strategies that allow them to demonstrate that and providing the right support. So, are there any
not that I
can
see, but I think it's time to round up anyway. So thank you very much again, Tom, for today's presentation. And yes, before we finish, I just wanted to remind you that tomorrow you will get an email with a link to the video recording of the webinar and also a survey. So if you've got any feedback, please do complete the survey. And I also have a few announcements, although Tom has already mentioned the upcoming courses. So just to recap, we have got 2 courses coming up before the summer. The first one, which starts on the 14th of April, is Language Awareness for Teaching Staff. And as Tom has said, is aimed at teaching staff, regardless of their subject specialism, who are proficient in English but didn't study English grammar at school, or perhaps those who have forgotten it all. And it will develop participants' awareness of how the English language works, what areas of English learners with the EAL may find particularly difficult or confusing, and it will offer practical strategies for supporting EAL learners in those areas. And as I mentioned in the chat box, there is a primary and a secondary version of the course. They both run between the same dates, so starting on the 14th of April. And then starting on the 19th of May is the course for teaching assistants, again aiming to familiarise them with some of the challenges that learners using EAL might face, and also introducing practical strategies for supporting learners who use EAL specifically for teaching assistants. And as Tom has already mentioned as well, further courses, including the courses on assessment, will be available from September. You can find out more about the upcoming courses on our website in the Language for Results International section on the Bell Foundation website. And if you want to be kept up to date, you can also sign up for our newsletter so that you'll never miss a course or you never miss a webinar that's coming up. So thank you very much, everyone, for taking part in today's webinar. And we will stop recording and end the meeting now.